story of the Canadian connection to Israel's rebirth has a personal link for Victoria and myself. The Great Fire Revival of Winnipeg began in this tent just a few blocks from our home in Elmwood Park on the Red River, where I walked my dogs Ziggy and Tucker for many years, every day right past where this tent was situated. And as Pastor Tom Campbell told us, this tent revival led to the founding of Zion Apostolic Church right across the river from Elmwood Park. And it was from Zion Church that Reverend William Hull went with his wife Lillian about 1935 to found Zion Apostolic Mission in Jerusalem. William Hull had been in Jerusalem for 12 years when the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine came to town in the summer of 1947. And that is the crux of our story about the Canadian connection to Israel's rebirth. But before we look at Hull's role in that, and the role of a second Canadian, Judge Ivan Rand, it is important to review what led up to the UN's involvement in 1947. It is important because the story of Israel's rebirth has been radically twisted by those who today challenge Israel's legitimacy as a nation. There is a backstory that needs telling and retelling by all who desire justice and truth in our generation. Knowing this history will help us as we stand with Israel today. We won't go back to Abraham or Muhammad. We don't have time for that. You can follow the long version of this story through a seminar I've recorded called The Case for Israel, A Justice Perspective. It's available on flash drive through our office. We are going to start with the end of World War I. The allocation of borders and mandates by the victorious allies of World War I is pivotal and still determinative today. I'm speaking of the San Remo Agreement, the Covenant of the League of Nations, and the British Mandate for Palestine. The war ended in 1918. The San Remo Agreement and the Covenant of the League of Nations were signed in 1920, and the British governed Palestine under the British Mandate from 1923 to 1947. After World War I, empires were broken up in Europe. The Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and German empires, broken up by the Allies into many new nations. The Baltic nations, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland, and many more. The Ottoman Empire had also fallen to the Allies as it had sided with Germany in the war. And there was a desire to create nation-states in the Middle East out of the Ottoman Empire, as was being done in Europe. US President Woodrow Wilson had offered his 12 points for peace, which included granting self-determination to people groups. And so the Allies and the League of Nations created 3 mandates out of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Now, what was a mandate? A mandate was provisional recognition of a nation subject to administrative assistance from a major power until that new nation can stand alone. France was given supervision of the mandate for Syria. Britain was given supervision of 2 mandates for Mesopotamia or Iraq and Palestine. Prior to the end of the war, Britain had already expressed interest in supporting a Jewish homeland in the area of Palestine. This was its Balfour Declaration in 1917. Lord Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, was a Christian Zionist, as was Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Balfour sent a letter to Lord Lionel Rothschild, the unofficial leader of the worldwide Jewish community. The letter said, His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors for the achievement of this object. This letter was the Balfour Declaration. And so Britain was given the mandate for Palestine by the League of Nations. This was agreed to by all 51 nations who attended the San Remo Conference on the Italian Riviera, and it was enshrined in the Covenant of the League of Nations. Lord Curzon, leader of the British delegation at San Remo, called the San Remo Agreement Israel's Magna Carta. And nothing has superseded San Remo in the years since in terms of international law. Yet Israel's enemies unceasingly claim it is contradicting international law, by allowing settlement in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank. That is nonsense. Israel's enemies cite the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1948 and Security Council Resolution 242 of 1967, but neither one of these has a legitimate application to Israel's presence in Judea and Samaria or Gaza, and certainly not to the whole of Israel. The only thing that would supersede these existing international laws from post-World War I, granting all of Palestine for a Jewish homeland, would be if a treaty were signed between Israel and the Palestinians, agreeing to create a Palestinian state on part of that land. And such a treaty has been offered to the Palestinians at least 5 times over the decades, and these offers have always been refused. First, 1937, the Peel Commission, then 1947, the UN Partition Plan that we will come to shortly, then in 1967, the aftermath of the Six-Day War, and twice under the Oslo process, 2000 at Camp David and 2008. Now, I'm rehearsing this story tonight because Israel's enemies relentlessly and falsely accuse her of being an illegal occupier. Most Westerners believe Israel illegally occupies the so-called West Bank, Judea and Samaria, but most Arabs and Muslims believe she illegally occupies all of the former Palestine. We have seen the mobs chanting these past months, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." Israel's enemies will not relent from their attacks on a Jewish state of any size. So, what happened to the British mandate for Palestine? Well, the British failed miserably in their job as a mandatory power. Although the government of the day was led by Christian Zionists, Lord Balfour and Prime Minister Lloyd George, the government, bureaucracy, and the military leadership were anything but supportive of giving the Jewish people a homeland, especially under the pressure of Arab opposition. And so the first thing the British did under their mandate was to give away 77% of the Jewish homeland to an Arab sheikh to become the Emirate of Transjordan. Winston Churchill and Lawrence of Arabia were players in this event. I don't fully understand what went down. What I can say is that it is an indication of the conflicts and the pressures in the process of the restoration of Israel. And it is an indication of the double-mindedness of Great Britain, which was given this huge responsibility. We are still living with these today, the conflicts and the pressures. But we also see that God is working out His purposes for the regathering of His people in the land He promised to them. The stated goal of the British mandate was that Britain was to encourage close settlement of all of Palestine by the Jewish people without impinging on the civil and religious rights of the existing Arab population of Palestine. But between 1922 and 1947, the British allowed Arab immigration to proceed almost unimpeded from the surrounding Arab countries, while at the same time restricting Jewish immigration severely. And tragically, this was during the lead up to the Holocaust. During the Holocaust and after the Holocaust, it can fairly be said that this British policy cost millions of Jewish lives. The Jews of Europe had nowhere to go. In addition to this immigration travesty, the British kept the Jews from arming themselves as civil war developed in Palestine, while allowing the Arabs free rein to arm themselves. Time does not allow me to elaborate on this sad story of the British dereliction of their mandate responsibility, but here are 2 brief examples. First, a story we all know of, the ship Exodus. It brought 4,000 Jewish Holocaust survivors on a ramshackle freighter to the Palestine port of Haifa, trying to escape the DP camps of Europe. The British rammed it 7 times, boarded it, murdering unarmed men. Then they towed it to Cyprus, where the Jews were imprisoned. And this happened on July 28, 1947, while the members of the United Nations Special Committee were in Palestine, and they heard of it. A second example, Ord Wingate was one British military officer who did support the Jewish people. He helped them organize self-defense brigades to defend their villages and farms from Arab attacks. For his support of the Jews, his superiors sent him out of Palestine to Burma, where he died soon after in a plane crash. It is said that he would likely have become the first head of the IDF had he not been sent away. The bottom line is that all of Palestine should have become a Jewish homeland had the British done their job, but by 1947, the Arabs had been so appeased and empowered that there was no longer an option to give Palestine to the Jews. The only option left for the Jewish people was another partition following the Jordan one, an option the Jews were willing and in fact overjoyed to accept. The Arabs, not so much. They started a war, as you know. So with that backstory, we turn now to the Canadian connection to Israel's rebirth. We are in the summer of 1947. Great Britain has given the United Nations its notice of withdrawing from administering the mandate for Palestine. Britain is broke and fed up. The United Nations has, in its turn, appointed 11 neutral nations, including Canada, to UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. The UNSCOP delegates made a 15-day tour of Palestine, a 5-day trip to Syria and Lebanon because the Arabs refused to meet them in Jerusalem. They made a 1-day visit to the King of Transjordan in Amman, and a 7-day tour of the DP camps in Germany and Austria, where thousands of Holocaust survivors still languished. Canada's representative to the committee was Supreme Court Judge Ivan Rand. Now, Canada was a reluctant member of the committee. This was the era of the Jewish refugee ship St. Louis, which Canada turned back, and the era of the none is too many attitude of Canada to Jewish Holocaust refugees. But Prime Minister Mackenzie King was apparently pressured by US President Harry Truman to be involved. To keep Rand neutral, he was briefed by the Department of External Affairs concerning two great historic tragedies, the Holocaust, of course, and the Muslim defeat by the Mongols in 1286. Quite a stretch to find a parallel. According to Yankee Faulkner, the Irish Jewish historian who was in Winnipeg in 2015, William Hull was the only Canadian Christian living in Jerusalem at the time. Hull was intensely interested in the hearings being held in the Jerusalem YMCA, and he managed to have a conversation with Judge Rand at a coffee break. Rand suggested supper together. He was eager to make sense of the situation beyond political considerations, and here was a fellow Canadian who had lived in a number of years in Palestine. Researcher John Ross writes that Hull was an old-timer in Jerusalem. Everybody knew him, and he knew everybody, whether Jew or Arab. This reminds me of Dr. G. Douglas Young, the founder of Bridges for Peace, who would fulfill this same role 20 years later, a Canadian Christian who was known by everybody in Jerusalem. So William Hull was a fellow Canadian, and amazingly, Judge Rand realized that he knew Hull's father, who was a lawyer in Western Canada. Rand later would write the foreword to Hull's book, The Fall and Rising of Israel. You can obtain this book from our office. Rand describes their dinner in his foreword. Somewhat to my surprise, I listened to words of high admiration for the Jewish people, their standards of life, and the tremendous work they had done since returning to their ancient homeland. This sympathetic attitude released within me a vague constraint of doubt, uncertainty, and puzzlement, which I see now the limited one-sided acquaintance I had had to that time with the Palestine question had generated in me. If I may translate, the veil of his anti-Jewish prejudice was lifted by William Hull's admiration for the Jews. Wikipedia comments that Rand's meeting with William Lovell Hull changed Rand's understanding of Zionism. Rand returned to his fellow committee members with a clarity of mind and heart. The Jews deserved, indeed must, have a state. He became UNSCOP's de facto conscience, including opposing a move to bring the British into the discussions, and another move to strip the proposed Jewish state of the Negev, thus shrinking it to a meaningless size. "I won't allow you to be placed in a territorial ghetto," Rand told David Horowitz of the Jewish Agency negotiating team. William Hull also spoke to the committee directly by letter. He was responding to an Anglican bishop who had testified that in his opinion, the Jews had no claim on Palestine, for all the Old Testament promises were, he said, abrogated by the New Testament. Hull wrote a letter on behalf, he said, of the majority of evangelical believers around the world, contradicting the bishop's view and also connecting the Balfour Declaration to the very belief that God would again bring the Jews back to their homeland. After 2 months of deliberating, UNSCOP recommended partition into an Arab and a Jewish state. As I said earlier, the option of fulfilling the British mandate for a Jewish homeland in all of Palestine had been lost for the time being. Canada had played a large part in the UNSCOP decision. Hull writes, "Judge Rand inspired, supervised, and shaped the drafting of the plan, and then his spirit of determination and fair play saw it through. The inscrutable Judge Rand had been compelled to reveal how deeply he had been stirred by what he had seen and heard while in Palestine, and what a tremendous impression Jewish enterprise, courage, and faith had made upon him." Yankee Faulkner, in his book, God's Little Errand Boys, writes that without Rand, it is unlikely that UNSCOP would have so persuasively recommended to the UN General Assembly the establishment of a Jewish state. And without William Hull, it is unlikely that Rand could have asserted his authority over the UNSCOP delegates. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that is the story of the Canadian connection to Israel's rebirth. I hope it thrills you as it thrills me. Purim is celebrated by the Jewish people every year. It is the story of how one person, Queen Esther, can impact God's purposes. We are in another time when the very existence of the Jewish people is being threatened by Satan and his spirit of Amalek. And so I encourage you to hear these words of Mordecai to Esther as also meant for you. He said to Esther, "If you keep silence at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether or not you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this." William Hull did not keep silent. Judge Ivan Rand did not keep silent. May you and I, who have been granted a measure of understanding of God's purposes for Israel and the Jewish people, resolve in our hearts and minds that we too will not keep silent, that we too know that we have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. In every generation there are those who try to destroy God's chosen people. Together may we say that standing with Israel is standing with God. William Hull returned to Canada following his time in Jerusalem. Bruce Martin, until recently pastor of Calvary Temple in Winnipeg, was his pastor in Simcoe, Ontario. Here now is Bruce sharing about his relationship with William and Lillian Hull.